Who won the Cold War? Most people say America, and by military and political measures, they're right. The Soviet Union collapsed, NATO expanded. American culture spread to every corner of the globe through soft power, and the United States dollar remained the world's reserve currency. For a brief moment in history, the United States stood alone, one superpower, one dominant economy, one global system. And yet, while that victory was being celebrated, something else was already happening. A different competition had begun. One with no declaration of war, no battlefield, no peace treaty. No moment anyone could snap their fingers and realize and say that was it. The first phase was already over, because while the world was focused on military power, political influence, and cultural dominance, China was focused on something else, something less visible, something far more patient. Not military dominance, but economic dependence. Over the next 40 years, China would quietly position itself at the center of systems the modern world could no longer function without. This is the story of how that happened, and why it may be one of the most successful economic strategies in modern history. We need to go back to 1978. At the time, China looked nothing like the country we know it today. It was poor, largely rural, economically isolated. Its economy was smaller than many individual US states. Very few people looked at China in 1978 and thought, that's the future. Then, Deng Xiaoping came to power. And what fascinates me isn't simply that he wanted China to become rich. Every country wants that. What's fascinating is the question China appeared to be asking, America had spent decades asking. How do we remain the world's most powerful country in the world? China asked something different. How do we become indispensable? That is a completely different strategy. Because if you're indispensable, you don't necessarily need to be the strongest. You simply need to become the country everyone depends on. China didn't rush into military confrontation. It didn't attempt to export and compete ideology. Instead, it focused on economic capability, industrial capability, manufacturing capability, and most importantly, system capability. In video 2, we talked about the difference between visibility and ownership. The most powerful position isn't always the most visible one. It's the one that controls what everybody else depends on. China understood that distinction at a national level and built accordingly. While most countries thought in election cycles, China was thinking in decades. And that long-term thinking would prove to be one of the most successful strategies in modern history. The first move was manufacturing. Western companies were not forced into China. They went willingly. Labor was cheaper, production costs were lower, profit margins of course increased. From a pure business perspective, the decision made perfect sense. If you were running a company in the 1980s or 1990s, you probably would have made the same call. Factories moved, supply chains followed, and China welcomed them, of course. At first glance, this looked like a simple story about cheap labor. But China wasn't simply gaining jobs, it was gaining knowledge. Every factory brought expertise. Every production line brought experience. Every supplier network strengthens China's industrial ecosystem. Every engineer trained inside those facilities represented a transfer of capabilities that stayed in China long after the contracts expired. The West saw cheaper products. China saw an education. And over time, that education became something much larger, an industrial ecosystem unlike anything the world has seen before. Today, when you buy a smartphone, a household appliance, an electronic device, or countless other products, there's a strong chance that part of that product passed through China. Not because China got lucky, because China spent decades deliberately positioning itself at the center of production, or should I say global production. And once enough industries become dependent on your manufacturing base, you gain something far more valuable than revenue. You gain leverage. The same leverage we talked about in Greenwood, the same leverage we talked about in the Bank of Italy. China just applied that same principle across 1.4 billion people. One reason this topic resonates with me personally is because I've spent time in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And if you've never been there, it's difficult to appreciate just how resource rich that country is. There's gold, there's copper, and there's cobalt, and also coltan. Resources that power the modern global economy. The DRC holds an estimated 50% of the world's cobalt reserves. Cobalt's inside every electric vehicle, every smartphone, every laptop on the planet. On paper, the Congo should be one of the wealthiest countries on earth. But standing in Kinshasa, I kept noticing something. Every day I drove along the crowded streets of Le Boulevard du 30 Juin, named after June 30, 1960, the day the Congo became independent from Belgium. It was a constant reminder that political independence and economic control are not always the same thing. And whether I was traveling through Kinshasa or the eastern part of the country, I kept coming back to the same question. Why can a country possess so much wealth and still struggle to capture the value it creates? Having resources and controlling resources are not the same thing. And that may be one of the most important lessons in economics, because the value isn't always captured where the resource is found. Sometimes the value is captured where it's processed, where it's financed, where it's distributed, where it's transformed into something the world depends on. That's the ownership question. It's one of the reasons so many resource-rich countries continue to struggle despite possessing massive amounts of natural wealth. China understood this distinction earlier than anyone else did, which is why it didn't simply focus on acquiring resources. It focused on controlling the value chain surrounding those resources, because whoever controls the systems captures most of the value the system produces. That's not a new idea. We saw it in Greenwood, we saw it in the Congo, now we're watching China apply it globally. Most people have heard of oil. Very few spend time thinking about rare earth elements, but these materials are inside virtually everything that defines modern life. Smartphones, electric vehicles, missile-guided systems, and artificial intelligence. Now pause for a moment and think about the recent war in Iran. You see, without rare earth minerals, the modern economy becomes significantly harder to operate. China recognized this reality long before most governments did, and instead of focusing solely on mining, China focused heavily on processing. That distinction matters enormously. Mining generates revenue, processing generates leverage. Because processing requires infrastructural technical expertise, refineries, and industrial ecosystems that take decades to build. Today, China dominates key portions of multiple critical mineral supply chains, not necessarily because it owns every resource, but because it invested in the systems needed to transform those resources into usable products. In 2010, China demonstrated exactly what that ownership meant. During a territorial dispute with Japan, China quietly restricted rare earth exports to Japanese manufacturers. Japan's electronics and automotive industries began feeling the pressures almost immediately. The dispute exposed how dependent major industrial economies had become on Chinese supply chains. No military actions, no sanctions, no shots fired. Just a quiet, precise application of ownership as leverage. That is what system control actually looks like as a geopolitical weapon. By the 2010s, China had manufacturing dominance and resource control. The next move was in infrastructure, ports, railroads, roads, power plants, and telecommunication systems. Projects stretching across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and parts of Europe. This became known as the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the largest infrastructure investments programs in modern history. Supporters view it as development, critics view it as influence. Either way, it expanded China's role in critical global infrastructure. But regardless of perspective, one fact remains. China was helping build systems, and systems create leverage, because whoever helps build the infrastructure gains influence over how that infrastructure operates. The clearest example is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. After Sri Lanka struggled to repay its debt, China secured a 99-year lease on the port in 2017, a strategically located deep water port on one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. No military operation required, just a patient application of the ownership principle. At a global scale, one can argue that this wasn't a military strategy. However, it appears to be an economic one, measured in decades rather than news cycles. But no strategy is without limits, and China still faces one critical vulnerability: semiconductors. The most advanced chips power artificial intelligence, modern weapon systems, data centers, and virtually every major technology sector. The most advanced semiconductor manufacturing capabilities remain concentrated in a handful of locations, most notably Taiwan. And the company at the center of that is TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. TSMC produces chips that China cannot yet replicate at scale. That simple fact is why Taiwan is the most geopolitically sensitive piece of real estate on Earth right now. This is not primarily about democracy or ideology. It is about ownership of the most critical technology systems in the modern economy. Whoever controls advanced chip manufacturing controls the foundation of the next century of of economic and military power. The United States recognized this and responded with the CHIPS Act, committing over $50 billion to rebuilding domestic semiconductor manufacturing. You can find them in places like Texas or Arizona, because American policymakers finally understood what China had understood for decades. You cannot afford to depend on systems you don't control. China is investing hundreds of billions of dollars to close this gap. Whether it succeeds in the next decade will determine more about the global balance of power than any other military development. The more we study and experience history, the more we see the same pattern repeating. Different countries, different cultures, different centuries. However, same principles. Ownership compounds. Systems create leverage. Institutions outlast individuals. China didn't become one of the most influential economies in the world because it won a war. It became influential because it spent 4 decades quietly positioning itself at the center of the systems the world increasingly depended on. Manufacturing, supply chains, critical minerals, infrastructure, and industrial capability. 3 videos into this series, the lessons haven't changed. Greenwheel built it. The Bank of Italy built it. China built it. Different scales, different eras, different contexts. Same principles though. The groups and nations that shape the future are rarely the loudest in the room. They're the ones quietly building what everyone else eventually depends on. Because power isn't always about who wins the battle. Sometimes it's about who built the systems the battle can't function without. What does this framework look like right now? Not in 1921, not in 1978, but China's story raises a much bigger question. If ownership creates leverage, why do some of the most resource-rich countries on Earth remain poor? The Democratic Republic of Congo holds vast reserves of cobalt. Nigeria sits on enormous oil wealth, and Venezuela possesses some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And yet natural wealth has not always translated into prosperity. Why? Because having resources and controlling the systems around those resources are not the same thing. Because the gap between having wealth and controlling wealth may be one of the most important economic questions of our time. Next video, we'll explore what economists call the resource curse, and why some of the wealthiest places on Earth struggle to capture the value beneath their own feet. Subscribe if you want to be part of that conversation. Until next time.